It's a pleasure to speak with you again, sir.
Always great to be here with the script doctor. We always have great conversations, so I'm looking forward to this one.
Yes, and this is one I think the audience is really going to like because it's about post-production, and we've seen some things over the last few years in post-production that we've never seen before. Certain aspects of things, and I wanted to go and bring you into this because I've heard you mention this story on your Rob Observations show multiple times. How you had to take a terrible movie and make it mediocre, and I believe it was called Heist. Uh,
Yeah, that was the original title was The Asphalt Quartet,
the Asphalt
and
Quartet.
that was the second movie that I did that for. The first movie I worked with actor Peter Billingsley. It was a full moon movie called Arcade. That Arcade was a full moon movie. Full Moon made the Puppet Master movies and the Trancers movies. It was Charlie Band's company after Empire, and at Empire, Charlie had made From Beyond, and he had made Reanimator, and Charlie had been producing these low budget movies all the way back into the 70s with Tourist Trap and Laser Blast. And when I was hired at Full Moon, I was literally hired because they had this movie that was directed by Albert Pune. And he was making two movies at the same time. He was making Doll Man, and he was making Arcade. And he was like going back and forth between sets. And Arcade was kind of a Tron ripoff where kids were sort of sucked into this video game. And so the movie was shot in 35 millimeter, but then everything in the video game world was shot with on digibeta, which was an NTSC video format. And then they were going to composite the effects of the virtual world. All the characters are shot in front of a blue screen. And then because the movie was never going to be, there's never going to be a film print, it was going to be finished on video. So you had the 35 millimeter negative of the real world, and then this video version of the kids sucked into the video game. But the movie was edited in about 10 days, and the video effects were terrible. And so the movie was put on a shelf for 2 years. And Paramount, that was releasing all the Full Moon movies, said this movie's unreleasable, but Full Moon still owed Paramount Arcade. And after 2 years, they're like, you guys owe us this movie that we paid for. So Full Moon had to deliver a film that they'd already rejected. So I was hired to come on this project to work with Peter Billingsley, who's actually in the movie. And then he was the original assistant editor, and he was telling me the stories of, yeah, we cut this movie in like 10 days. But now they were going to have new special effects done, and we were supposed to reconstitute the movie and drop in the new special effects. And so Peter and I started doing this, and I looked at Peter, and they retransferred all the negative. And there was a lot of the movie that was never edited. There was all this stuff that they never used. And I said to Peter, I go, this movie could be a lot better. And he goes, yeah, but we only had 10 days to cut it in the first place. And I said, but it's here. Like, why don't we recut the movie and make it better? And then we'll get the new effects and drop them in. And Peter's like, well, we can't just recut a movie. We have to like fly the idea up the flagpole. And I said, okay. So I called my friend Dan Schweiger, he'd already worked at Full Moon in promotions, cutting trailers, and he was spearheading this restoration of this movie. And I said to Dan, I go, Dan, why don't we recut the film? We can make it better. He's like, oh man, what do you know about editing movies? And I said, well, I did take an editing course at USC. I got an A in that. I've been cutting music videos and short films and stuff. How hard can it be? And he got approval from Charlie Band. And so he said, I'll look at the first 10 minutes of the movie. So Peter and I basically lived in this post house and recut the beginning of the film the way we thought it should go. We didn't even have the new effects yet, so we couldn't even get to the effect sequences. And I have to say, this was the movie where we took something that was really unwatchable and we turned it to something that was really mediocre. But it was infinitely better than what we'd started with. And they said to us, Charlie Band said, okay, I will put up the money. and you guys recut the movie. And suddenly I'm editing a feature film. And that was in 1993. And
And
Arcade was actually nominated for Best Independent Direct to Video Release of the Year that year after
so
we finished it.
basically, I mean, this is the type of stories that I like hearing because it is essentially fits the definition of fix it in post.
This movie was entirely fixed in post. Everything about it.
Yes, and this is something that prior to I would say the digital age, it was never really a mantra on film sets. It was like, oh, if something happens that doesn't work right now, we have to fix it now. But
Yes.
over the years, as digital came into place, as people were able to push its limits further and further, we changed from this perspective of, man, let's just get the shot right so we don't have to worry too much about it in post to, okay, well, we made our day. So even though it didn't get exactly what it was, we can probably we'll fix it in post. And this became, I think, a crutch. Now, you spent days living in that post-production house.
Oh, we were on that movie for almost a year after we decided, because we weren't even using, this was pre Avid.
Mhm,
So we were cutting this because the movie, even though people need to understand that a lot of post production in the 80s and 90s, things were finished. If you weren't going to cut negative, things were finished on what was the video standard at the time, NTSC video, 640 by 480, basically,
mhm.
which is standard definition video. It's terrible compared to high definition video now. 1920 by 1080 is basically 6 times better, and 4K is 4 times better than that. So we were working at a very low resolution, and that's all that it existed at the time. But what it gave you was a lot of flexibility, because suddenly you had access to video post-production tools that, since CG wasn't the norm at a low budget, Jurassic Park was, we were working in the same year that Jurassic Park came out and revolutionized digital effects. So the digital effects we were using were still basically television video toaster level effects. But still, we were able to take this movie, and because people are going to watch it only on TV, we could give it 10 times the production value if it was only shot on film. So we had a whole world opened up to us, that we couldn't, that we if this movie were all shot on film. The funny thing about people, you just brought it up, people used to think that, okay, during the actual physical production, principal photography phase of a movie, whatever lightning in a bottle that you're going to capture, that was all you could do. That was it.
Mhm.
Once you shot, you're done. You weren't going to go back and reshoot, because who had the money? So much of Hollywood history, I mean, movies now, after Terminator 2 was the first $100 million movie, well, then they could go back and do whatever they wanted. But for the most part, movie budgets were small.
Yeah.
So if you didn't go and capture what you needed to capture during principal photography, it was too expensive to go back and reshoot stuff. I mean, you had to work with what you had. That was it.
Well, sometimes studios would say this is how many reels of film you get, and that's it. When you're
Yeah.
done.
Oh, and when you're an independent production, you'd shoot on like short ends. You'd buy film that was repackaged from other shoots.
Mhm.
And if you had what were short ends, say you were going to get a 50-foot magazine or something, and well, some of that film was already used, so you might get a 22-foot reel, and you buy short ends because they were cheaper. And
Yeah.
that way you do whatever you could to extend that budget further, but you certainly didn't have any extra money to go reshoot things. So you had to figure out ways in post-production to fix the problems that might have cropped up, or if you were missing something. You mentioned the movie Heist. Heist was terrible. It was one of the worst, horrible movies that was done in the post Pulp Fiction era, where everybody wanted to be Quentin Tarantino. And my favorite story about that is, so this movie Heist, it was called The Asphalt Quartet when I worked on it. Again, it was a movie that was cut together very quickly. And when I looked at it, I was hired to cut a trailer for the movie. And when I sat down, the production company said, well, here's the Avid where they actually edited the film. So you have access to all the dailies and you can see everything. And I looked through, the movie was just god awful and it wasn't well done at all. And it wasn't finished correctly at all. But I cut a trailer, and the producer, Mort Salkind, I kind of, he was to put it, he was kind of the Jewish Tony Soprano. That's how I thought of him. And he paid for this movie, and he loved my trailer. He loved the trailer I cut. And then he asked me, well, what do you think of the movie? I said, this movie's terrible. It's just terrible. And not only is it terrible, but again, there's so much more here. There's so much more footage here that wasn't properly addressed, and you could do a lot more with this film than than how it currently exists. And he paid me this was in I want to say 97. He paid me a lot of money to recut the movie. He said, you can do whatever you want with this movie. I'll pay you for 2 weeks. And if I like what you've done, I'll go with your cut of the movie. And I'm like, okay. So I basically moved into that edit bay and for 2 weeks recut this movie. They watched my cut of the movie and they loved it. But this is the best part. This is the kicker of this story. So Mort Salkind says to me, he goes, you know what this movie needs? It needs an action scene in the beginning. and I'm like, yeah. And he goes, maybe can you just make it? Can you put an action scene at the beginning? Well, they didn't shoot an action scene. And I'm just thinking, I wasn't going to say no.
Right.
I'm like, well, I can try to do something with what's here. And it was so ridiculous. I mean, it was a guy running down an alleyway who tripped. It was a blown take where he tripped over a garbage can. It was actor Glenn Plummer. So I just made an audio montage of like the police and footfalls and somebody being chased all off screen. And it was like a montage of the city. And then you see this guy run, and I put bullets, and then he trips like he's being shot at. It's just, and then I used early Photoshop and had the Asphalt Quartet come on the screen, and then bullets shot through it. And I used the light filters to make the light coming through the title. It was ridiculous. It was stupid, but it was what he wanted. And he's like, "That's great. Let's go with that." And working on these, I mean, I never followed a normal editor's path. I just became a post guy where I would work specifically with first-time directors or ultra low budget movies, because working on Arcade, I learned all about digital post-production starting in 93. And a lot of people that were jumping into the indie films were happening all the time, but most of them you didn't actually see. Mm-hmm. So I worked on a lot of movies that no one's ever seen. They're not even on video. You can't get them, but that doesn't mean we didn't put as much love and care into the post-production process as possible. But because of non-linear editing at the time, it was really Avid only. Mm-hmm. We didn't have Final Cut yet. There was no Adobe Premiere. But it was a really exciting time to be in post.
Well, it brings me back to what I was doing in high school and also in college. We had linear editing machines. We also had this one unit project where every single shot or every single shot was on its own either Betamax or VHS tape, and it was all logged. And we had to take all those tapes, watch them, and then cut together a feature film as part of our major assignment. So you have to put them into the linear edit machine, set your in and outs, put it onto your main timeline. You also had to record your in and outs and this was something that my teacher at the time didn't tell us until the very end. The reason why we had to record the in and outs for every scene and every take that we had is because when he was doing stuff in North Hollywood to work on that, they did this experiment where they shot on film, they transferred the reels to a beta tape or a VHS tape so that they could edit it and in pseudo digitally, and then they'd record all the time codes, and then they'd go and edit it properly on film in one kind of quick cut. Like they only had to cut the film once and tape it together for the final assembly, as opposed to cutting it multiple times, taping it, gluing it, all that type of stuff. This was their method to do that because they could get these Betamax and VHS tapes very, very cheap for some reason. And they could transfer it all on there and then just kind of skip the process where they could experiment and screw up as much as they want without having to reorder new prints of the negative to recut.
Yeah, it was well, so for people who don't know, um when a movie was shot on film, you would get dupes of the footage shot, and that's what you would use to edit with. And then the actual negative was cut. But what you would get is there were on the sides of the film, there were what are called key code numbers. Every frame had a key code number.
Mhm.
For nonlinear editing for Avid's systems, you would get, so you'd go and you'd put up all the negative on a machine, and then they would transfer it to tape, and they would give you what were called flex files that would have your key code numbers, there was a video time code, and then your audio time code that would match with the audio that was your production audio that was created at the time. And that was an extra added expense, in the post-production process, to get those numbers on a computer disk. And what you could then do is you would take the videotape that your footage was transferred to, digitize it, and then you would have the key code numbers that would match the footage on videotape. So the video footage would actually match back to the actual real key code numbers that are on the actual film itself. And then because you have the flex file information that was made at the post house, every frame, the digital frame, actually had the key code number on it. And you would create an EDL, which was actually your negative cut list. And so when you were done editing digitally, you could kick out a negative cut list that the negative cutter could then use and go back to the original negative of the film and make all of the edits and make them properly.
Yep.
And it was great. Now, what sometimes happened, actually, this happened once, but I heard of it happening a lot more, is that one of the problems with this is that a lot of people didn't understand digital post-production at the time, especially in the low budget arena. So a lot of young producers would not pay for flex files. So if you had all this information, it was burned in to the picture. But if you didn't get the computer disks, which was just data with your flex file information on it, so you'd have to digitize the videotape, which had a burn-in window with the information. But a lot of people thought that burn-in window was enough. But that burn-in window with all that information was not in your computer. It was just part of the video, the picture.
Mhm.
What you needed it in your computer as well. So each edit had those key code numbers that you could then spit out later. But if you didn't pay that extra step to get those flex files made, that information wasn't in the computer. And I was working on a project where these producers, they were cutting another feature next to me for, I don't know, 3-4 months. And then I heard one of the producers screaming, and he came into my edit bay and he's like, "You got to help us. We're done cutting and we have to get our cut list, our EDL to the negative cutter. We have to have our negative cut list to the negative cutter." And I sit down and I look and I realize that there was no key code information in the computer. They didn't get the flex files. So the whole point of being able to cut digitally is that you can take your key code information and give it to your negative cutter, like you said, so the negative only has to be touched once when they actually cut it. And I said to the producer, I'm like, "Hey, yo, man, where's all the flex file information?" And he's like, "Oh, we didn't spend the money to get the flex files made because it's much more laborious on the telecine side." And I'm like, "Wait a minute, you guys didn't get flex files?" And he's like, "No, but we didn't. So, but we still have to cut out, spit out our negative cut list." I'm like, "Dude, there's no information in your computer to spit out. That's what you have to put the flex file information in to correspond to the tape." He's like, "But we see the flex file information on the picture." I go, "Yeah, that's just added that's on your picture. That it doesn't correspond to anything." And I said, "You're lucky to have burn-in window because now you can sit down and write
Mhm.
all and the key code numbers were letters and numbers that were all, they were like 10 numbers and
10 characters
characters
long. Yeah.
long.
Yep.
And you have an in point and an out point for every edit.
Yep.
So that's four sets of numbers, four sets of characters for every cut. And I'm like, got to get to writing, get that legal pad. And it's because nobody in the digital world, especially in the low budget arena, nobody would tell you this unless you had somebody who knew this working with you, like your editor or a post-production supervisor. It was like the Wild West. And that's why I kept getting these jobs. I kept getting recommended for other editorial jobs at the time, because I learned, and I only learned my way through trial and error. I never sat down and nobody briefed me on this. I just learned starting with Full Moon, doing arcade, and then worked my way through it for the next 8 years. It was crazy.
And I would say one of the things that I appreciate by the stories that you share about these situations is that it really does highlight the value of preparedness when it comes to actual production. Something that I've seen in the independent spheres, or at least for the last decade or so, is severely lacking. And I know that you directed a Cinemax
A series,
series
yeah. Yeah.
that you had reduced time, and the way that you were able to make up for it is by, well, preparing as much as you could so that you could get the most out of each day.
Yeah, I mean, the funny thing that I've always found strange at the, especially at the indie level, is the process of making movies hasn't changed in over 100 years.
Mhm.
It's the same. The tools are a little different, but the process is the same. And the best way to be successful in any production is to plan ahead. It's not, it literally isn't rocket science, but it is a science that's been proven for a century. And to not prepare, you do so at your own peril, because it's going to save you. The more prep you have, it's going to save you money and it's going to save you time. And both of those things, if you have more time, which you will if you plan, you're going to have more time for setups. You might get an extra shot at the end of the day, which is always what you want. And you have to have people that know what they're doing in order to make that a reality. And I understand when you're working at the low budget level, it's hard to get that, but it's a necessity. And I cannot stress enough how important it is to plan ahead on every level when you're making a movie.
That's one of the things that's why I lean into the writing a lot, is that what I've seen recently out of the bigger studios, especially when you're reading in the trades that certain films are going back for reshoots and whatnot, the question that I always raise is how much imagination is being used by the people in the development process to actually form what the final picture should look like before they start shooting. Because of the stories that I'm seeing now, with the advantage of the technology, which makes it easier in one regard to put together a film, but not necessarily makes it easier to actually make a film. Because there's anyone can shoot something and put together and call it a movie, but we have subconsciously developed a sense where we recognize this is an actual movie and this is just scenes strung together. And they're not the same. Although you could argue there are some people in the studio system that don't know that difference. And I think that's kind of what leads into what some issues that we've been seeing here as audience members watching, and also industry professionals watching our colleagues put out stuff that feels incomplete and does not justify the expense behind it. One of the things that I wanted to bring up is the fact that yes, you had people that prepared very well on their films. The script was tight, the acting was good, the coverage was there, all the shots were needed. Yet when they put together a cut based off the script and the structure, they see something that they otherwise couldn't have foreseen. And this doesn't always happen, but it does happen every once in a while. And the result is, well, we've got a movie, it's not working. How do we make it work? That's where the benefit of post-production comes in, more so than ever before, because you have, as some filmmakers say, you make the movie three times. You write it, you shoot it, and then you edit it. And sometimes the last edit is almost unrecognizable to what you wrote, but you have the story that you're trying to tell comes through. And this I felt in the dawn of the digital age, and at least in the first decade or so of it, it was less and less an issue just to tweak a movie, a finished product in post production. Whereas now it feels like the movie is being completely made only in post production to the point where you're no longer fixing it in post. You're kind of breaking it in post because it's not there yet. It's still mangled in pieces, and you're just kind of bashing it together just to try and make something coherent out of it. And I'm just trying to fathom like where, how did we get to this point? Because we had the discipline of film reels at the time when we shot with film that was washed away with digital, but there was a reflex when it came to digital at that time from filmmakers that worked with film where they were like, no, this is our day, this is our time, this is how much we can use, we're going to make sure we get the shots that we need, and then we're going to move on. Yes, we've reduced the expense of actually paying for film, but the time to shoot still remains the same. But now we have come to this age where they shoot the movie for 6 to 8 weeks or 6 to 10 weeks, whatever the
Yep.
schedule is. They get an assembly cut. They start post production plates for whatever special effects they want to do. They realize something is wrong. They then restart production to go back for reshoots, shoot what they think will fix the film. Then they go back again, and then they realize, oh, the stuff that we meant to fix, we forgot to tell the digital effects crew to stop working on that, and they haven't. So now they all that work they have to do is be thrown out. So they've lost a few months of work. They still got paid for it, but it's completely useless now because it no longer jives with the rest of the film. And now they have to start over. But one thing that hasn't changed is that release date. And I remember when a movie was announced, they'd give you a broad window of when it would be released, but that date was always subject to change because it always was, we're not going to release it until we know the movie is serviceable enough to bring an audience to it and ideally see it multiple times. Now that doesn't seem to be the case. And what I pose to you is, do you remember when you started noticing this kind of shift where essentially you put, whether it's an independent film, whether it's a big budget, either actioneer, drama, what have you, um, where they just kind of said, you know what, we'll throw more money at it, as opposed to, hey, maybe we should take a minute, see what it is we're actually doing here, and seeing if this is actually going to work. Like, when did you start noticing these type of elements occurring? Not to be on the downer side of things, but I think we can identify the problem. We can have fun with the flexibility of what current day post production can actually bring to films and independent films.
Yeah. I mean, again, it seems academic, but I remember, so I worked at one of my first jobs in the industry was I worked in feature production at Warner Brothers. I was a management trainee. And the feature production department at Warner Brothers studios are broken up into at the highest levels. You have the executive level, the executives that are high above everybody. They oversee everyone. And then you have the senior vice presidents that are dealing with creative, that are dealing with what movies are actually going to get made. And they meet with the writers and they develop the projects. And those are usually generally considered to be the most important people at the studio. Then there's physical production. So our department, I worked for the senior vice president of physical production, Bill Young, and we oversaw the actual day-to-day production of every movie that Warner Brothers would make. And sometimes there was 15 movies in production. And I worked so there was my boss, Bill Young, and then there were three what were called executive production managers. And I worked for one named Kurt Newman, and he would have like 5 movies going, and he was overseeing the physical production of those 5 movies. The first time I ever noticed something that I was thought, wow, that's wacky, was Lethal Weapon 3. And I remember when Lethal Weapon 3 was getting made, they didn't like the script. They kept talking about how it needed work, but they had to push it into production because they had a release date and all this, and a lot of schedules, and everything was up in the air. And I'm like, the movie doesn't, if you watch Lethal Weapon 3, it doesn't really have much of an ending.
No.
And I was just like, why would it fascinated me that they knew the script wasn't entirely there, but they pushed it into production anyway. And they figured that, oh, we'll fix it as we go. First of all, this never works. I mean, somebody will throw out, well, this worked. It like Gladiator is an example of a movie. They literally were writing the script as they were shooting it, and it worked. Miraculously, it worked. Now, sometimes it can work. 99.9% of the time, it doesn't work. So there's always some outlier somebody will throw in your direction. But it made me realize that, okay, well, once you've done that, once you're making something, then you're the idea of doing reshoots suddenly becomes palatable, because it's like we knew this movie wasn't entirely working, but we were able to we got enough of it shot that we'll fix it in post. And I don't know if that was the first time I ever heard that phrase
Hmm.
was on Lethal Weapon 3, but that was a sentiment that was suddenly floated as something that, yeah, that's acceptable. If a movie wasn't working, and I was working at Warner Brothers when Bonfire of the Vanities was being made, and Nothing But Trouble, and Clint Eastwood's The Rookie. I was there when there was not a lot of great movies coming out of the studio at that time.
Hmm.
And then we did a lot of movies like My Blue Heaven or Doc Hollywood. It was so all this studio programmer stuff. Um, but so it was always weird to me that they would even launch into making a movie without having something pat, something I thought was really great, ready to go. Why? I understand, even if you have to make some horrendous release date, why hobble yourself out of the gate by going with a script that you weren't entirely happy with? That push the movie, because ultimately, and then the there's an equation. So is it going to be more expensive to push the movie, or more expensive to shoot it now and then we'll fix whatever we get in post? And people always think that maybe we can fix it in post, it'll be cheaper. In my experience, it's never ever cheaper to fix something in post.
Well,
Never
post
ever ever.
production, the thing is that, and this is one of the lessons I learned early on, is that post production can take as long as production, if not longer. Why do anything to extend that when you can solve it on the day, or do enough preparation to avoid the conflict before shooting? Um, it's always, I mean, I always look at it this way. It's actually cheaper to write the script and shoot the film than it is to actually put it together and get it released.
Yeah, I mean, in a way it's true. I mean, you know how much your days are going to cost when you're in production. Here's the schedule, here's how much money we have to, and so you can break down exactly how much money you're spending every day. Whereas in post production, theoretically, the DGA allows a director to work on a film for 10 weeks before the studio has to get a look at their cut. So you have 10 weeks to cut the movie. The thing is, now in our digital world, you can try 100 different things. You're not taping film together. You're literally you can open up a movie, you can jump into a film whenever you want and play with it for as long as you want. So sometimes you can have 8 different versions of a scene that you like, and you're like, I don't know which one I really like. Well, that didn't even exist before the mid 90s. The idea that you could just play with the scene forever, that didn't exist because it was too difficult to try. Eventually, how many times are you going to look at a scene? How much time do you have when you're literally cutting pieces of celluloid together? So people, I think, they knew their vision, they knew their work more. They'd make decisions and stick to those decisions, as opposed to the digital world where you can play to your heart's content. And so people don't have to be. You can, and there's and everybody has more opportunity. Everyone's girlfriend can weigh in and go, can you change that? We'll go, sure, why not? We'll try it. And the studio executives know that too. We can change this as long as we want. But once you get into that mindset, it's laborious. So you're paying your editor, somebody's working, and what could have been a 10-week editorial session suddenly is like 52 weeks.
Mhm.
And you've been there for a year, and you're paying people. You're paying assistant editors, you're paying sound editors, you're paying your picture cutter. I mean, it's a trap. It's a big trap, the
It's
non-linear post-production world.
Well, I always looked at it as when you are presented with so many options, almost to the point of limitless options, you lose sight of your own vision
Yes.
because you're there's always the potential for more. And that's something that I think has At least not so much on some of the other studios side. I don't see this being a big problem over at Warner Brothers and Paramount today. But I know this is kind of an issue when it comes to Sony and Disney right now, is that it just kind of gets out of hand to the point where there doesn't appear to, well, there may have been an intention for a vision, especially from like the directors and writers, and even to an extent the post production. The the amount of options that are presented and the fact that the producers are getting far more involved creatively has, I
Yeah.
think, caused a lack of vision because there's two visions probably competing with each other. And
Oh,
and I,
100%.
and I think like I like the idea that there's always going to be an opportunity where you can actually manipulate something to the benefit of the film that you otherwise couldn't have done before. I think that's kind of useful because it's you never know until you're actually able to like give yourself a little distance away from it. But at the same time, I've also been very worried because there's been this very valid point of contention with the actors when it comes to artificial intelligence capturing performances and whatnot. And one of the things that's been brought up that I thought was fascinating, and it does affect greatly in post production, is what happens when you have one actor acting opposite an AI recreation of another performance. Post production can do a lot to make that physically work. But one thing it doesn't address is the fact that an actor is giving something to the person they're playing opposite of, and a digital recreation is not able to do that. And how
Right.
much more even with the flexibility and the limitlessness of post production that there is, how is anyone in post production able to reconcile that to capture that very type of magic that two humans can interact with when it's now one human in a digital recreation, or worse yet, two digital recreations talking to each other and not in the same way as two actors are talking to each other if they're voicing an animated project? It
I
just boggles the mind.
No, it's a strange thing. I mean, I honestly believe, and this comes down to uh a preference that only history will be able to tell us if this is true or not. But I firmly believe that one of the appeals of watching, now I'm talking about motion pictures, movies,
Mhm.
is that we as an audience know that we're watching real people, that it was made by people. So when you're watching actors on a screen, even though they're playing, Humphrey Bogart's playing Rick Blaine at his Cafe American, in Casablanca, we know it's Humphrey Bogart. We like watching Humphrey Bogart. We like watching the humanity, him being a human being, even though he's playing a character. And there's something to be said for the fact that there's a camera crew and everything is lit, everything is created by human beings. And we want to look into the eyes of other human beings 40 feet tall on a screen. I wonder if now when you're watching animated characters, we've had animated characters since the dawn of cinema. So we know though when we're watching animated characters that they're either drawn or now generated in a computer. But they're still, or there's not that expectation of looking at a human being. You're looking at something that's animated. And the voices that animation had, like Mel Blanc,
Mhm.
one of the great when you're suffering succotash, you loved hearing Mel Blanc's voice doing animated characters. But if we're going to watch animated characters that are created by AI, that have artificial voices that are created by AI, that might end up having storylines by I wonder if those entirely AI generated stories are going to work for people. That are people going to be able to accept an AI? Because the subtle nuances that human beings bring to projects, whether they're animated projects or whether they're live action, is what gives them the truth that human beings want to feel. Like I've always said, we want we want truthful fiction. And we know what that means in the sense that when you're hearing a story and you don't believe a plot point because a writer tried to skirt around an issue and you're like, oh, come on, that couldn't happen in real life.
Hmm.
Like watching 24. Anybody who lived in LA, you watch 24 and you realize you know exactly how long it takes to get from one freeway off ramp to downtown LA. And if they do it in 9 minutes in a show where we all know it's going to take 28 minutes in real life, especially during that time of day, then suddenly it starts to not ring true.
Yeah.
And people that don't live in LA don't have that problem, so you could get away with it. But I wonder if we're going to feel like things don't ring true, and no amount of post production can help that. So I'm curious about how our AI future is going to look without with entirely AI generated material. But like you were saying, can you make a conversation with an AI generated character or work with a human character? That's where editorial can come in. Editorial can help that, because you can pick the different takes or the different tonalities that an actor could do, and you could caress it in and make it kind of work. I mean, I think one of the examples when it doesn't work is the Phantom Menace,
Hmm.
the first Star Wars prequel, because George Lucas was able to use digital technology. He could take line readings from one line, or he would cut people in half and use a take where they're doing this and put it on the body of a different take. And I think if you watch the Phantom Menace, and I have no, this is just an intuition I've always felt about that movie. It's so messed with in post production that there's not a genuine moment in the entire film. I
It
mean, all the performances, there's not one line of dialogue in that movie, especially from the human characters, that feels actually natural. It's all weird and stilted because it's George Lucas messed with all of it in post.
you see, that's one of the things that I was very worried about because that's something that's still done to this day. You can have a two shot of two actors and you can have maybe 4 or 5 different takes of it, but now you can cobble together from that two shot of a sixth or seventh take because you're getting different performances from each actor from different takes and you're mixing and matching them in that two shot. But the thing is, and I don't know if current, at least younger directors have picked up on this yet, but they should have. It should be one of the first things they picked up on is that the energy between those two actors is different. That's where the life is. That's where you have that stilted perspective with your example of the Phantom Menace. Someone is giving energy in one level, and then it's not being reciprocated back on the same level because that performance is from a different take with a different level of energy. And so now we have this invisible wall of separation between the characters that are interacting to the point where it feels robotic and it feels like AI. and
Yeah.
and it's one of the things that perplexes me a little bit because we're already seeing it now. And then I think one of the things that's going to happen with post production and AI is that they're going to find a performance that they really like from a human actor and another that they really like from another human actor, but they're not going to have that energy there. And they're going to try and use AI to artificially create that energy between those two performances because the lighting is right. Maybe one of the actors looks sexier in this take than they do in all the others, but what they're saying or how they're delivering it doesn't match up to the reversal. So they got to find a way to blend that in there, and AI can take that, scan it, digitize it, and then manipulate ever so slightly enough to make it possibly work. But I'm worried is like once that the door is opened up, does it release the floodgates to the point where we're no longer having actors do multiple takes or experiment in the actual production aspect of things? They're just doing the one take, and then it goes to post production, and now the entire performance is being tweaked and altered and manipulated to fit whatever else they had, where essentially you're shooting a storyboard and then virtually animating it with real life models for 15, 20, 52 weeks.
I think you're 100% accurate. What you just said is absolutely what's going to happen, because the biggest cost in making movies for the most part is labor. And if you could just you get your actors. I mean, the thing is, this is why it's going to go all digital, all virtual, all AI, because at a certain point, why bother to go shoot a film on location or even on sets on a soundstage when you can just create them virtually and you have 3D space, and then you just digitize actors, you know, and you digitize their voice. You're going to hire an actor to be in a movie, and they're going to work for a day
Yeah.
because they're going to come in and to make it easier, just have them do a bunch of poses, turn their heads around, and make all the digital information that you need, and they'll figure out what phrases that an actor needs to read and whatever, you know, the
Like the
crazy
Mission
brown
Impossible thing.
fuck.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you have that, and then once you've got that, and you've got the actor digitized, and you've got your entire location or locations, you don't have to make anything anymore. It's all virtual, and you do everything in the computer. And so you're never going to go out on set. My whole thing with that is, and maybe it'll get to a point where it's so good. I just don't, I wonder if humanity will have an interest in watching the results, like philosophically,
Yeah.
or will they not care? Because I think, one of the things that's never going to be replaced, like you think about AI, like you can ask AI to generate a concerto or something, but nothing is going to ever replace, like if you go into if you're in Paris and you go into a smoky jazz club, because they can still smoke there, and you watch a great jazz trio play for a couple hours, nothing is ever going to replace what it feels like to sit in a cafe with a drink in your hand, maybe a cigarette, and listen to great jazz being played by a group of people that really know how to play their instruments, and they can change it up and freestyle and whatever they need to do. AI will never ever be able to take that away, because it just won't, that whole experience. That's why I'm always saying that authenticity is the currency of the 21st century, because if you can have an authentic experience, provide an authentic experience, and have an authentic experience, it's going to be something that we don't get anymore. And what I really worry about is if post-production comes to the point where all movies are going to be created now in post, there's going to be no principal photography. I guess pre-production would be the time you're coming up with a story and somebody has to design all these backgrounds and things.
Mm-hmm.
It's just depressing to me, because that's no longer the art form. That's more, I would see that more akin to writing. I could see writers, it's going to be like an author writing a book, and a single person's going to end up being able to write a movie, create an entire movie, everything about it, using prompts.
It's basically, it's like an adjacent form of animation, because with animation you have the artist actually create everything, but and you have your actors voicing and you have your writers writing, but you don't actually have crew. You don't have drivers, you don't have craft, you
No,
don't have
but
any of those things at that frequency. And it's basically like you're squeezing out one of the most vital aspects of filmmaking and creating these hyper realistic looking digital puppets.
yeah, and I think ultimately, and look, there's great animation and there's not so great animation, and it
Hmm.
all comes down to the human input. At the end of the day, that human beings have to decide what's good and what's bad. And the great directors in animation they're as good as live action directors.
Hmm.
They have to understand how to tell a story and how to keep an audience engaged and all of those things. But I do think that at the end of the day, you have to have that human hand, that knows what's up, that ultimately says. But again, when you go back, and now we're going to have photorealistic animated movies like The Lion King or something, but you're expected. I remember, seeing Final Fantasy. I keep going back to the Final Fantasy feature film, the sci-fi feature film from, I don't know what, the aughts. I don't remember
Is the
what year.
early aughts with Donald Sutherland, if I remember
Yeah,
correctly.
yeah. I didn't. First of all, the characters were all uncanny valley.
Hmm.
But I remember watching it going, okay, this movie is being billed. I mean, animation is fun because it's not real. You're not looking at photorealistic people or photorealistic environments. You're looking at interesting stylized environments. And when, like, I love Japanese anime. I remember seeing Akira, but even Akira is still stylized. It's not like you're looking at something that's supposed to be photorealistic. Whereas I think people are going to want to use AI and make photorealistic movies. And once we get there, and once you're watching something that's artificial, I just don't know how compelling that's going to be for people. I don't know, but I think what's interesting to me about you're asking what all of this is doing is people have to they have to plan less upfront. And if you're planning less upfront and the philosophy that you'll fix it in post, it means that what you're shooting initially or what you're making in the first place is not good enough because you think that you're going to try and fix it or do something in post that's going to fix whatever inherent problems you have going into something. If something that you can't make you can make a good script great. You can make a great script badly, but you can never take a bad script and make it great in
Right.
post. You can't.
And I
And
think the reliance on that hampers your ability to develop the eye to spot the problems beforehand.
exactly. And I think that what's really going to be unfortunate is everybody wants to create, everybody wants to be able to create, but unless you understand the underlying reasons why writing is good or why storytelling, cinematic storytelling is good, if you don't understand the basics, there's going to be a lot of garbage that you're going to have to wade through. I mean, there's a lot of people that don't understand the basics today. And you see a lot of that in filmmaking. I think there's a lot of people that, especially at the corporate level, because the producers have a lot more power. Movies are made far more like television these days than they are like the feature films of 30 or 40 years ago that were
That's
really
Yeah,
auteured.
that's very true. And I will say the two movies this year, or actually possibly three, I'd say to correct myself, three movies this year that were not made like television shows was Super Mario Brothers, Barbie, and Oppenheimer. And they all performed better than all the other films that were kind of made in the style like a television show.
Yeah.
And one of the things that you'll not see in the coverage of those three films, especially with Super Mario Brothers, is they didn't go back for reshoots. They didn't have post-production difficulties that caused rush jobs when it comes to their special effects and what they were doing in camera or what they had to insert after the fact.
Well, it's interesting. I have a 4K of Barbie, and I was watching. It has a lot of great, really insightful special features on it, surprisingly. And there was a lot of decisions about the stylization of that movie that had to be made up front. And Greta Gerwig she does what a great director does, an auteurist director does, having co-written the script. She had a very strong vision. And when you have a very strong vision and you can communicate that vision to all of your keys, then they know what's expected of them and they can give you what you want. There's a lot of people that wind up as directors. They get hired. They've done commercials or music videos, or they did something, or you need a diversity hire, and you hire somebody that checks a few boxes, but they haven't made as many things as they might need to have, and they're a little out of their depth. That's another thing that's happened. You have a guy like Colin Trevorrow who makes Safety Not Guaranteed, $1 million movie. Spielberg likes it, and his next project is directing Jurassic World. And it's like, how do you go from making Safety Not Guaranteed to Jurassic World? And by doing that, you never develop your auteur instincts that you're going to need. I mean, all of our grand masters that we love, like Martin Scorsese, they were making, he made Boxcar Bertha,
Mhm.
and he has made a lot of movies learning his craft. Nowadays, you can't because movies are too damn expensive. The studio movie that's going for global box office because the studios are now making movies. They used to be domestic, and when you'd have international success, it was great. But movies now are all being made for the international markets as well. And the international markets are not necessarily as discerning. So you end up with action movies, and as long as the action's good, and that's another thing. I mean, there's where AI is really going to start to interfere, I think, and that action sequences are going to be completely AI generated.
Yeah.
Why put people in harm's way? They're practically done that way now. How much, you watch a car chase, how many Fast and Furious car chases are actually real cars on the road? There's some, sure,
Hmm.
but a lot of it's augmented in post.
Yeah,
And
we're not going to get another Vanishing Point.
no,
And
it's a
and
great
and who is
example.
alive today to actually demonstrate those types of skills? Because I don't think there's really a talent for that anymore. the stuff that they do that isn't generated by a computer or by AI, you can tell that they're not driving at the speed with which they're trying to shoot it at.
Right. Yeah, and it's a problem. That was an interesting thing before we did this, recorded the show. The Furiosa trailer dropped,
Hmm.
and you could see. I mean, it was nice to see real cars again,
Yes.
even though the it's very highly stylized, the color palette and everything. I know from Fury Road that while there is a lot of CG assistance in that movie, it was real vehicles that you're watching, and you can tell because the way they move and the way it's very difficult to duplicate that. So, yeah, I mean, I wonder the whole AI thing really, I think it's baffling. I think that it's for me, it's too early to say whether a new generation of people will accept that kind of storytelling. I just don't know.
The thing
But
is that I'm with you. I don't know if they'll accept it, but I do know that there's definitely enough people in the industry willing to push it forward
yep,
because they're using it to solve problems that otherwise should have been avoided beforehand. Right now, like you can use AI to actually increase render times on digital plates. And one thing that I'll bring up, I don't want to dwell on this company too much because again, I want this to be more philosophical. But when Marvel created the position of executive producer in charge of post production for animation, film, and television, that was a big red flag to me because, as you would know, whenever you have a producer who oversees production, they're pretty much involved in post anyways, and they're also
right.
involved in development. But once you throw in another voice in there and you give them that title, you've created a tier system where that person is now above the person that's the producer of actual production. So if that person has their own point of view of how the movie should be, they're the ones that are in a position of power where they can basically change it in post, alter it in post, order reshoots, and there's nothing else that the people below them can do because the hierarchy has been established. Well, now this is the number two person. They're in charge of everything that is in post production, and that is a level of power consolidated to one person that actually compromises, I think, what was being done for the movie. One of the things that I've been hearing through over a dozen different people that I know out in California about Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania is that they had um, original digital plates being put in and processed, ready to go for what they had shot prior to their discovery in November that they had to go back and reshoot. And
Yeah,
they had a February, or sorry, yeah, I think it was it was like a February or March release date for the film. So when you're reshooting the movie in November and December, you don't have enough time in January, February, March to render your new special effects plates, get them in there, get them to match up uh, seamlessly so that they can be convincing for your audience. And we saw that in bold with that movie. And the question I'd have is when you have that type of position, when you have those opportunities with the advancements in technology for production and post production, where in the culture of the entertainment industry are we going to encourage the idea of not abusing such a tool?
well, yeah, I mean, I think that's first of all, I think what's happened, especially at the studio level, why we're seeing so much disappointment is we see less and less auteurship from the directing side because the directors are less and less important. Everything is being prevised, which I know a lot of great previs companies, but when something's already prevised, and a lot of time an effects company is working, or a previs company, like the third floor is working, they're already prevising huge action sequences sometimes before directors even hired on the project. So the director of these projects are sort of inheriting work that's already been done, but that work is look, effects people can write or make great action sequences. They can animatics people can do great pre-visualization. But the problem is they're only thinking about those individual sequences that they're working on. How are those sequences going to work with the scenes of our characters just talking to one another?
Mhm.
So I think one of the problems with a lot of these big, giant tentpole properties is they feel very disconnected from themselves. Because, like, you look at Quantum Mania, Marvel has a whole visual design development team that's at work years in advance of these movies getting made. So somebody will make this really cool digital vista of what the quantum realm looks like with all the colors and everything in there. But the person who's making that is thinking about, oh, I got to make this cool quantum realm. Awesome. But when our characters, when Scott Lang is walking through this quantum realm, can we make the audience believe it? Like what is the effect of the audience? Because if you, one of the things that I think has been problematic both with Love and Thunder and Quantum Mania from a post-production standpoint is they've removed the reality from these movies. And one of the things people used to complain that the Marvel Cinematic Universe kind of had a plain cinematography style, whereas you look at Zack Snyder's highly stylized version of the DCEU. But the thing that the MCU did so well, beginning with Iron Man 1, was it made you believe that what was you were watching was happening outside your window somewhere.
Yeah.
Iron Man 1 is very photorealistic. You know, you meet Tony Stark in the back of a car, back of a Humvee in that movie, talking to soldiers, and it looks very much of the real world. And part of the reason the MCU, like that fight scene in Civil War, you're at a real airport. You're not at some like stylized, futuristic, bigger than life version of an airport. It looks and feels like a real airport. So when you're watching these, when Ant-Man becomes Giant Man and gets thrown into an airplane, it's like, oh my God, you know, we as an audience are thinking, what would that be like if I was sitting there watching this happen? But when you're in the quantum realm in Quantum Mania, you're in Oz, you're in Fantasyland, you're in a place that doesn't exist. So we as audience members turn it off because there's nothing analogous to our world anymore. So it becomes boring, you know, and I think that was a big problem. And that's because the look of those things gets decided before a director even comes on board the project. And it's a director who has to keep all this straight and make the audience believe. And when so much pre-visualization and so much design work is done before the directors is even arrived and they inherit all this material, it can be very incongruous and not all work together. And the director is supposed to make it work together, but ultimately he didn't get to make those decisions, or she didn't make those decisions, or they didn't get to make those decisions. So it could be very problematic. And I think people don't necessarily think in those kind of terms because nowadays everybody believes at the studio level that they can have that, or they should have input, because it's so expensive to make a movie now. And everyone's so risk averse that nobody wants to cede control or that much control to a director. I mean, the Marvel directors are, we found out that the Marvel's director, she left to go work on her new movie in England. She like wasn't there for the last 4 months of post.
Yeah.
Because they don't need her to be there. But then I would say, well, then who is, I mean, yeah, Kevin Feige is a good storyteller. He worked his way up in the industry, but who's making the decisions now?
Yes. And here's the other part. Now someone's making a decision that wasn't there on set during production. They're probably looking at whatever notes were made by script supervisor and assistant AD and all the people that were, commenting on every take they had. But now those notes are being read by someone else who may not fully understand what the context or the shorthand is for that. I mean,
Yes.
we have Robert Weiss had his notes for Star Trek: The Motion Picture, which was used recently for their restoration. My understanding is that those notes were incredibly detailed to the point where they weren't really too open for interpretation.
Right.
But not many people, I would say, today have that level of detail when it comes to notes of what they have. I've been script supervisors on feature films and television shows where I'm told, okay, that scene, I like that. And I have to write a check mark and a shorthand says director like that. This is what they want for final cut. There's nothing more. But I've heard from other directors with like, I love that take. This is why I like about it. This is why we're going to use it. This is the mind. This is the perspective I'm going to have because I'm going to tell you all these notes to put down because when we shoot tomorrow, the next part of this sequence, I want what I loved about this part to carry over into the next part because my plan is to try and get that next shot to line up with what I just achieved here.
Yeah.
And they have to record that because there's so many things on their mind. They might forget it or they might not fully remember the entirety of that thought. So they try to get it down now.
Yeah, and I think that the quality of a director, um, the directors that there are very few directors I think that are working today that are worth following
Yeah.
necessarily that have because the auteur theory, which came out of the Cahiers du Cinema and the French critics that later became filmmakers themselves. The idea of that auteur theory that the director was the author of the film. Um, I think there's something to be said for that. And a lot of people work on movies, but they still need to be guided by a sure hand. And when you're deciding how to tell a story, you need that. And I think a lot of what's happened with studio filmmaking, I mean, we had a lot of directors that would work within the studio system that they themselves still had a signature style that you felt like a guy like Wolfgang Peterson,
Hmm.
who came out of Germany, made Das Boot. But when you saw him make a Clint Eastwood movie like In the Line of Fire, the way he shot sequences and the way he let scenes play out, you knew that Wolfgang Peterson was a certain kind of director and you were going to get something from Wolfgang Peterson. But when he was making In the Line of Fire, that movie didn't cost $200 million or $150 million or $100 million. And so Wolfgang Peterson, who really knew how to make a movie and knew how to convey in his scenes what he wanted to convey, I don't think we have a lot of directors who know how to do that these days, because there's both a literary component to it and a cinematic component to it. And I think the great directors understood both. And I think a lot of the people that are making movies these days don't understand that. These directors also understood editing,
Hmm.
and I think that unfortunately we don't have a lot of that going on. I mean, one of the things, as I edited my first feature, and as an editor, I was mad at my director who didn't give me a lot of transitions. And I was the director. And I realized that this was something I learned on the job. I learned about, oh, I really wish I'd spent more time planning and paying attention to how scenes were going to translate. How was I going to transition from one scene to another? Now the movie was so haphazard. I mean, it was well produced, but we shot 40 locations in 20 days. It was insane. It was ridiculous. We didn't
That
know
is
we didn't know.
ridiculous.
I mean, the whole thing was insane. And because I'm like, we're going to go to all practical locations in and around LA. It was ridiculous. It was not the proper way to make the movie. And I was running and gunning and I'd get one or two takes. And, if I were able, and it's the only movie I've ever directed, but I'd like to do it again because now I understand a lot more about the process. But I think a lot of our directors on these studio movies, there's so many people taking over that they direct a scene like television. They figure the producers, the VFX people, then they get it and they'll make it complete.
Hmm.
But I think nowadays there is not enough of there's not enough of a director working with his keys to make a movie work.
One
I
thing
think
I think there's not enough of a director because there's this new staple that I've noticed when it comes to directing on the indie sphere, which I guess has kind of taken over a little bit more in the mainstream with few exceptions, of course. And that is they get their wide shot, they get their medium, they get their close-ups and reversals, and once they've achieved those, they move on to the next. Every once in a while, you get the crazy 360 shot, but not often do you see oneers in
no.
cinema anymore. Not often do you see um, anything when it comes to cinematography that's trying to focus on the main characters doing something, but showing us a camera movement in an interesting way to complement that. Sometimes we get an interesting camera movement that has nothing to do with what the actors are doing on screen.
Yeah, I think you nailed it 100% there, because getting standard coverage is just what people do, and I think that's, once you have that, you're protected, because then the studio or the producers can go in and cut something however you want, you know. But and I think directors who are working for studios and working for streamers are encouraged to shoot that way. But if you have a director that really wants to do something interesting with a oneer, I think back to one of my favorite uh, exposition scenes. It's basically a oneer is when Indiana Jones is explaining to Denholm Elliott at the beginning of Raiders of the Lost Ark. They're having a conversation, and Indy's packing to go look for the Lost Ark of the Covenant, and the camera's basically, it's one long block scene where you're going across this room while he's packing and talking to Marcus Brody. It's like a big long oneer.
Yeah.
Or the scene in Jaws when they take the little ferry from one side to the other. You know, you yell shark, and we have a panic on our hands on the 4th of July. And that scene plays out in one. They go from one side of the dock,
Hmm.
they get on the ferry, they take the ferry goes out in the water, comes to the other side, and it's one conversation. People won't do that anymore because the studio won't let you. You have to shoot standard coverage so the studio can come in and cut it any way they want. And a oneer, you have nowhere to go. And I think that oneers and those kinds of shots are what directors used to know how to do. There's one of my favorite things that was ever on TV was I, Claudius, the original BBC I, Claudius. And there's a few videos on YouTube where you can go watch how masterfully directed I, Claudius was. Like there's a great scene with Augustus Caesar, and it's a big, long, like oneer. And it's because these theater directors who became movie directors, they understood how to block a scene. That's a lost art. There's so many YouTube channels if you can look at breakdowns and analysis of who's making movies and how they made their movies and these shots. I mean, you can see this Raiders, somebody did a great breakdown of the scene I'm talking about. But I don't think a lot of people that are making movies today know about that, because blocking is not something that you're necessarily that's not cinema, that's theater.
Hmm.
you know and of course it is cinema too, because you have to figure out a way to make the camera moves there as well. But it's much easier, especially with television and streaming, to get standard coverage and use that.
Well,
But
not only that, it helps you make your day a lot faster, right?
it helps you yeah, because you don't have to spend a lot of time. And look, if you want to do a really crazy oneer, it could take 3 or 4 times as long as it is just to shoot standard coverage. So people are just encouraged to shoot standard coverage. And another thing is, like, you look at a Marvel movie, almost every shot is a blue screen or green screen or volume, or some kind of post-production work needs to be done somehow.
Hmm.
And that also turns everything into an effect shot. And if everything's an effect shot, that's why you have those second producers come on. And the effect shots, the producers, what producer is more important? The effects producer is, because there's effects in every single shot.
Exactly. And here's the other part too, is that so the volume is, I think, a marvel, but I don't believe that they're actually using it to its best
No.
ability. So we brought up car chases, vanishing point. The volume would be perfect for that, because now you can actually put a car in front of the volume, and you can basically have a live recording of someone going at a legitimate speed,
Yep.
and you can composite that in to the car, get a wind machine, and you can make that very, very convincing, to the point where you can, because one of the camera tricks that they use nowadays is that when they're shooting a car chase scene, they have the camera very low to the pavement, close up on the wheels. And in some cases, if they get the permit, they repaint the divider lines shorter and closer together, so that when the camera's following the car, it looks like they're speeding up fast. But the thing is that you can't hide that when it comes to actual pavement, and the grain that's on the asphalt doesn't blur as much in comparison to everything else. So your mind already is telling yourself, yeah, they're only going like 30 miles an hour at best, but we're seeing the speedometer where they're going like 60 to 80. And it's like your mind is saying this isn't real. But with something like the volume, where you could use drone footage to record at that speed and then project it up on the volume, throw in the car, green screen your roads, which you can then digitally do, and then just have the car driving, get your actors in a very safe environment, and also experiment with camera movement in that chase. You can do a lot, but they're not using it for that. And instead they're just doing the lazier thing
Well,
where
that's yeah, the thing about the volume is you have to have pre-selected your shots so you know what the backgrounds are.
yeah,
And the problem is that once you have these backgrounds, you're kind of locked into that way of shooting it. And one of the things that's so much fun about, for those people who've never made a movie before, what happens is when you're on set, right? And you're setting up a shot. You bring your actors out, you've got your camera people, you decide, first of all, how you want to shoot the shot, and then you block the scene. You have the actors come out. So the camera crew knows where the cameras are going to go, where the setup is going to go. But what's really interesting is when you're blocking before you start shooting, sometimes the actors do some crazy shit and you go, wow, that's cool. Or you get another idea and you think based on what the actors do, you want to put the camera, you want to do something totally different based on their input. Well, you can't do that on the volume because you can't, first of all, you don't have a set to play with, but you're locked into whatever you acquired for yourself for that particular scene. And so the spontaneity, I feel that I think this plagues a lot of the Star Wars content that we've seen because the volume has made it very sort of monotone in a way. And the zest that you would normally get being able to like put the camera wherever you want is kind of gone. Whereas Andor was shot mostly on location. They didn't use the volume at all. And so they would go to these real locations and augment them later in post with giant laser cannons or something in the background. But because they were on real locations, there's a feel happening, a frisson with the actors and the camera and the combination of the two that you're able to create something that's much more dynamic than if you're just locked away shooting on a volume stage. And I think the volume is problematic from that standpoint. I mean, what'll be really interesting is if you have Unreal Engine and you can suddenly move around. You can have an entire virtual set move wherever you want. You can generate that set on the fly
well, that seems
virtually.
to be their end goal at
Yeah, of
that point.
course.
It's not just a virtual plate that plays out in front of the people or around the people within the volume itself. Um, Sometimes it's like, yeah, they want it to change. One
Oh
of the
yeah,
things that has been advantageous, especially considering Star Wars, is that the actors can be inside their cockpit and looking out the screen, which is actually looking towards the volume, and they can key in that star wipe effect and going into hyperspace in the shot,
yep. Which
which
is, I
allows
mean, that's amazing. And
it's amazing. And then the actors actually have something to act off of visually from that cue. Same thing when it comes to like the space battles. The only thing that unfortunately they didn't do well, especially considering with Ahsoka, is that the direction they gave to Rosario Dawson in regards to how she's piloting with the controls was very inauthentic, I'd say, to what was
yes,
actually being represented on screen.
yes, no, I totally agree. And that's another thing. That's where a director comes in.
Mhm.
A director has to understand, okay, here's what it looks like. And nowadays when a director directs these shows, they're not the ones controlling the final effect sequences. So they shoot the live action, they do the best they can, and then it's like when digital effects became a big deal, like in the 90s. I remember seeing movies, science fiction films, where the shot choices of virtual battle scenes in space, things went too fast. It was like a cacophony of noise because the effects guys are not people that understand how to build suspense. They're just putting as much stuff in the scene as they can to make it look cool. But that's not necessarily how to tell a story. And then it just becomes visual noise, and that's not something you want either. And I think that we're going to run the risk of that. Learning how to tell a story through cinema is an art form. Just like learning how to write well, you have to understand the tools in your toolbox, which are words and punctuation and all of that. Well, you have to learn the language of cinema as well. And I think it's getting harder and harder when people have less and less time to learn these things. I
Well,
mean,
do
it
they
takes a
really have
while.
less time to learn them, or are they just not willing to put in the effort? Because
Well, I
you
think it,
talk about the suspense aspect. Another story where it's something was saved in the edit is the climactic scene in Star Wars where Luke Skywalker does the trench run. In the original cut, he did the run twice, and
right.
Marshall Lucas cut it with Richard Chew and the other editor whose name's escaping me at the moment. They cut it down to a single time because the pacing the pacing was there with the special effects of what they shot for the actual battle and what they composited in there. The pacing was there and good. The performance was there as well. It was repeated. And when they consolidated it into one, it built the suspense, took it up to 11. And reminds me of the very true axiom especially when it comes to film and story is less is more. Instead of having two climactic-ish scenes of the same character doing the same thing, they made it one, and it now hits a lot harder. So,
Now that's a perfect thing that happens in post. You know, you do what's on the page and it seems like it's going to work, but then you realize, oh, it gets redundant and you can collapse things, and that's when post comes into play. One of the biggest lessons I learned along those same lines was when they were making the Two Towers, the Battle of Helm's Deep. Um, the editor and his assistant Jabez Olson, um, they cut this, what he said, a very tasty battle sequence, but then they realized when they were watching it that people got battle fatigue. This incredible battle that they created was boring
mhm.
because you're just watching this battle. But they realized if they cut it down and they were always telling the story from the perspective of Legolas, Gimli, or Aragorn, that we were always seeing the battle through their eyes, then the battle became more exciting. So the battle itself, you can have the greatest, coolest battle in the world, but if it's not personal to the audience, if you're not identifying if you're not watching the action through the eyes of our characters, then it doesn't work as well. And I thought that was a really important lesson to learn, and I think that's true of anything, you know, because everything has to have, just watching a bunch of cool visual effects is fine, but unless you have an emotional connection to what's going on, then it doesn't work. And I think that's something that they only learn through the post-production process. And I think that's where post is invaluable. And now, you know, you need the ability, I think filmmakers need the ability to learn those lessons. And I think sometimes as more of our movies are made by committee, people feel you get less and less of that people sit there and go, oh, this is not the right way to do this. So there's less time for people to solve these problems or even recognize that these problems exist.
I also think there's a certain level of detail orientation that, as a byproduct, creates overstimulation to the point where
Yep.
the mind just can't process it anymore. To go back to the effects teams that did the quantum realm, there's so much going on in there that your eyes gloss over.
Yep.
And when you also get into post production and you screw around with the cinematography to the point where the main characters, which were probably shot in a medium, and now you're pulling out, you're digitally recreating the rest of their body just to create an extreme wide shot so you can highlight the setting as opposed to the focus on the characters, that that takes away the intended impact that was originally shot and what was going on there because the effects were made before the director got on board. Or maybe the
Uh,
director was already on board and the effects were made before they even understood what they were going to be storyboarding, if they even got involved in the storyboarding process.
yeah, and I think that's really problematic with all these franchise properties. Is they're creating these set pieces independent of, sometimes, as I said, before they even get to making the movie. They're like, oh, we want to do this, we want to do that. I mean, you saw that with like the new Star Wars sequels. If you buy those the art of The Last Jedi, they have all these really great ideas,
Hmm.
beautiful paintings and things that they wanted to do that never made the film that were really, really cool. But it's like, okay, well, you're coming up with these great ideas, but how does that work within the context of the story? And like I love the Fast and Furious franchise but I can't watch it anymore. I can't watch. I tried watching. I literally, truth be told, I walked out of Fast X.
Wow.
I love these cheeseball movies. I love Fast Five. I think it's a terrific B movie, B action film with an A-list budget. Now, because there's no physics involved, I mean, the whole thing about a car race or car chase movie is we've all been in cars.
Hmm.
So we all know what it's like to ride in a car. So when you're watching a car zip around a city street at 100 miles an hour, we know what that's like. But when now all you're doing is relying on CG to create your car action, it's uh, it's not fun anymore. And I Fast X, the way it was cut, the way it was shot, I understand Louis Leterrier had to come in and take over because Justin Lin left.
Hmm.
But both Fast 9 and Fast 10 have no semblance of reality or physics in any of their chase sequences. And I'm like, I'm out. I can't watch this anymore because it's a cartoon. There's nothing in it. There's no shred of reality. So why am I watching this? I want to watch a car chase movie because I know that real cars are on the ground and they're really chasing each other. But if it's all CG, then what's the point? The whole reason for watching something like that is to watch the great car stunts that are being done. And if there's no longer car stunts being done and it's all CG, who cares? I don't care. And if the cars are all acting like they all defy physics, it's like, well, that's not fun anymore. It's
Yeah,
just
where's the
annoying.
risk? Yeah. If
There
you're
there's
defying
no
physics, then there's nothing for the characters to be at risk in, and you lose that connection um that you have with the audience, which is, oh, the stakes. Now, the stakes no longer hit the multiple tiers of, okay, well, first of all, you have the stakes of what happens if they succeed. Then you have the stakes of what happens if they fail. And then you have the stakes of, well, what happens if a character dies? And if you remove any one of those elements for the sake of a set piece, you've also crippled the set piece.
yeah. Yeah, and it's strange that we've gone that way. It's the same kind of thing we saw with visual effects in the dawn of the big CG era in the 90s and the early 2000s when you'd have all these great effect shots that were kind of designed in a vacuum. So you're watching this movie, then suddenly you're watching these effect sequences that they're not really tied to the main characters, so they don't really work. And again, it pulls you out of a movie. It makes you not involved. It might be the coolest looking thing in the world, but it has no, if it's not connected to the story that you're watching, then it just becomes something that it doesn't work. So
Yeah, and I think that's a great way to end this conversation. Uh, it's been fascinating talking with you as always, Robert. I love these types of conversations. I know the audience loves them as well. That's why I like to try and do them when time is available. Um, please let the listeners know what's in store for you in the coming days with your channel and anything else you want to
yeah,
plug.
well, you can find me on my channel, the Burnett Work. I mean, a lot of people have have lost a lot of subscribers because of my political views lately. But come on over. As I say to about my audience, all of you are imagination connoisseurs, and everybody's welcome. I love hearing all points of view, every shape, size, color, creed, whatever, from all the 28 known galaxies, as Jor-El said in Superman. So come on over to the Burnett Work on YouTube. And then I personally am finishing up a low budget horror film called White Devils, that's based on a South African playwright's play that I'm a producer on. I'm finishing up some editorial work on that. Hopefully we'll have it on the festival circuit in the next couple months. And then the thing I'm really excited about is I am adapting Max Allan Collins, the writer of Road to Perdition. I am directing and producing an audio drama based on his 19 book so far detective series, the Nathan Heller. It's called True Noir, the Nathan Heller Case Books. And the first story is set in 1932, and it deals with the assassination of Chicago Mayor Cermak, which actually happened, and how Nathan Heller was involved. And so it's an audio drama. It's been so much fun. Todd Stashwick, who people might have known from as the Deacon from the 12 Monkeys series, and Liam Shaw on Star Trek Picard season 3, he's playing Nathan Heller. And it's gonna have a lot of other SAG actors in it as well. So that's a lot of fun, and we're going to be crowdfunding that probably in mid-December or maybe into January, into the new year. But I wanted to do a Christmas promotion, but who knows if we're going to make it. So
Well, that sounds fantastic. Thank you again so much, Robert, for entertaining the people and mostly myself with when it comes to this conversation.
well,
Uh,
thanks
let
for
me
having
know,
me. I
guys.
love talking to you, man. This is great.
Yeah, and we're definitely going to do it again. I look forward to all the comments regarding this video. Uh, thank you so much, and never forget, guys, when it comes to great story, it all starts with the script.